Alright guys, this is Chapter 25, America and the Great War. This will be part 1 of 2. This goes right up until the United States actually joins World War I. Right now I would go and load up the notes from the website so you can go along and fill in the notes as you listen to me or read the book and look at the videos that I've included in the notes. Alright, Wilson and Foreign Affairs. You know, at the beginning of the chapter, there's a lot going on in the world. Wilson's just been elected. You have the whole background of progressivism and imperialism, you know, with expanding interests all over the globe for us and Europeans and their colonies. And Wilson is going to be an interesting guy to have in charge. He's going to be a little bit more sanctimonious than Roosevelt or Taft, and he has more of a moral agenda than those guys did. And interestingly enough, Wilson really doesn't have much experience in foreign policy. You know, if you think about it, he was the president of Princeton University, he was the governor of New Jersey. Both of those things didn't bring much of an international profile with it. There's even a quote in your book that says something along the lines of, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs," said Woodrow Wilson. And that's kind of ironic since at the beginning of his term he has to deal with stuff in the Caribbean and Mexico, and then eventually become the leader during World War I and kind of try to guide the world to the League of Nations idea. His first big thing is going to be dealing with the situation in Mexico. Mexico had a dictator named Diaz for somewhere around 24 years or so. And people had gotten sick of this, namely a guy by the name of Francisco Madero. And Madero actually had gained enough public support that he was trying to bring Diaz out of office. And Diaz has Madero thrown in jail, and during the time he's in jail, they have one of these fake elections, and Diaz gets reelected, and Madero gets out of jail and runs to San Antonio, and while he's in San Antonio, he sends a letter, and the letter basically says that the election was a sham, and that he should be in power. At which time, the sort of disgruntled people in Mexico, namely the poor and even some of the upper class, decided to revolt. And they threw out Diaz, and they were going to instill Madero now as their new leader. The problem was Madero was only going to be in charge for a short period of time because he wasn't decisive enough. He was too busy trying to placate everybody. And so eventually, he's going to be overthrown by his military commander, Victoriano Huerta. And the interesting thing was that Huerta was actually supported by the U.S. ambassador. It doesn't really get mentioned in the textbook, but him and the ambassador, who I don't remember his name, something like Thomas or something like that, basically think that Madero was too close also to the revolutionaries. Now, all of this is going to be for naught because it's going to be unpopular, and Wilson then will challenge basically the validity of Huerta as the president. He's going to support a guy by the name of Venustiano Carranza. Now Wilson is going to lift an arms embargo against Mexico to help support Carranza's forces against Huerta. He's even going to have supply ships off the coast of Tampico, which is going to lead to a little bit of an incident where these naval sailors are going to get arrested. And then Wilson uses some sort of nonsense about saluting a flag to use more intervention in Mexico. Now, he's eventually going to occupy Veracruz with U.S. Marines. This will bring the attention of the whole international community. And basically, Huerta and most of Mexico is going to be upset with the occupation of Veracruz. And so Argentina, Brazil, and Chile are the ABC powers offer to mediate a truce between the United States and Mexico. Well, what's going to happen is Huerta refuses the terms, which were basically, if he leaves office, the United States would leave. Well, this will undermine him with the Mexican people, and eventually it gets Carranza to be installed as president. Now, the only problem is at the same time, Carranza had other people working inside the revolution, like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, and a guy by the name of Pascual Orozco. And these guys are basically going to have like a little guerrilla campaign yet again, against the new government. And what it's going to do is going to draw the attention of Woodrow Wilson yet again, and he's going to General John J. Pershing down there to basically clean up the mess. All right, and what happens is Pancho Villa begins to murder American miners and eventually invades part of Columbus, New Mexico, and so there's more of a punitive type measure from Pershing and the United States against Pancho Villa, where they send 11,000 troops and they try to hunt him down. They never actually capture Pancho Villa, but they do destroy most of the base from which he can work from. Now, other stuff going on is going to be the sort of diplomacy of Woodrow Wilson. Prior to this, Taft had been more of what they refer to as a dollar diplomacy guy, which means he used U.S. business interests to support their governments, which means he sought favors for these businesses and stuff along that lines. Wilson saw this as a little bit more of a immoral, kind of wrong thing to do, and as it says in your textbook, the government he declared was not supporting any special interest groups, meaning businesses and so forth. And also it says, despite Wilson's public stand against using military force to back up American investments, however, he did use Marines in Nicaragua that had been there to sort of clean up a civil war. He also sent more Marines to Haiti, and those Marines basically were used to install pro-American governments, even though Wilson maybe didn't want to admit to it, but he was, using his political power and military power to help shape the Caribbean. Alright, the next section, an uneasy neutrality. Europe, over the last 100 years or so at this point, had kind of balanced itself out through alliances and military strength, and there was no one dominant power like you could look at through the rest of European history, be it French or British or Spanish or whatever. Now, in Eastern Europe, you have the Austria-Hungarian Empire run by the old Habsburgs, right? And they've expanded into parts of Eastern Europe, namely the Slavic countries of Serbia and Bosnia and all that sort of stuff. Well, eventually Archduke Franz Ferdinand is going to be assassinated by a Serbian nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip. Okay? And Princip was a member of a terrorist organization referred to as the Black Hand. And what happens is they were upset for the occupying of Serbia and Bosnia and all that sort of stuff, and were hoping to make those countries break away from the Austrian-Hungarian Empire so they could form their own Greater Serbia or Yugoslavia, whatever we want to call it. And there was a huge conspiracy by the armies of Serbia to smuggle weapons in to assassinate the Archduke. There's a video I put in the notes to watch about the assassination. It's not very long. It's like 3 minutes or something like that. It's pretty interesting. But they had an elaborate plan where they were going to throw bombs into the car and all that sort of stuff. And one of the bombs actually makes it in the car, bounces off, and blows up underneath the car, and some other people are hurt, but the Archduke and his wife are fine. The Archduke gets to the town hall, gives the speech, gets back in the car, wants to go talk to the people that were hurt from the bomb, and his driver takes a wrong turn, which kind of screws up most of the deal for the assassins. Eventually, Princip is outside of a bar and runs into and sees a chance or an opportunity to kill the Archduke. And so he shoots the Archduke and his wife at point-blank range, and eventually they die. Now, due to the factors we'll see in the next slide, this sets off a chain of events which causes World War II to happen. World War I to happen. Namely, the alliances and the nationalism and the militarism and all that sort of stuff, as we'll see in the next slide, causes this to happen. Okay, and then you get what they refer to as the Triple Alliance, or Central Powers, which is Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente are the Allied Powers, which is going to be France, Great Britain, and Russia. All right, and I think eventually Italy changes sides, and the Ottomans join in, and it kind of gets more and more convoluted. Guys in North Africa, the Japanese want German holdings, and so they join, and it becomes a true world war. Now, one of the big things about this war is the advancements in warfare, and how some nations had adopted them and some hadn't, and all the different changes. Over the length of the war, nearly 9 million people are going to die. combatants, civilians, the whole number. And there are going to be over 15 million people injured. And a reason for that is just the new technology that they were using. You had the advent of machine guns. You had high velocity rifles that were more accurate. Your textbook will talk about aerial bombing, which I find kind of interesting because nowadays it's so, precise. Back in the day, the guys used to actually hang their heads out of the planes or balloons or whatever and drop the bombs with their hands, excuse me. You have the advent of poison gas, all right? One of the things also, yet again, is poison gas. They would shell or drop bombs with this stuff on the enemy lines, but the thing was, they couldn't predict the wind direction. There was a serious chance that the wind would blow that gas to a neighboring town or back on them, or whoever shot it or whatever. And so those were really problems that they hadn't figured out yet. Also, the advent of flamethrowers, landmines, long-range artillery, not just cannons that kind of would fire, but artillery that could be shot from so far away that it was over the horizon, so it was kind of out of range of the enemy from seeing it. Also, with the advent of trench warfare, you have to figure out ways to defeat that, so the tank comes into being. Same thing with aerial bombardment. How can we get back there and attack them where they are without putting ourselves at risk? And trench warfare was actually a really gruesome thing. There's a quote in your textbook, or a line in your textbook, that says, "Trench warfare gave the First World War its lasting character. Most of the great battles involved hundreds of thousands of men crawling out of their muddy, rat-infested trenches and crossing no man's land to attack enemy positions, only to be pushed back a day or a week later. In addition to the dangers of enemy fire, soldiers were faced to deal with flooded trenches, terrible diseases such as trench fever and trench foot, which could lead to amputation. Lice, rats were constant companions. The stench was unbearable. Soldiers on both sides ate, slept, and fought among the dead and amid the reek of death." Just living in that condition had to have been horrible, one. And then two, the psychological problems caused that. This is the first time we see the advent of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is referred to at the time as shell shock, and how guys just would crack under the pressure and the constant fear of being shelled by enemy artillery, and the fragility of life, to be honest. Now, this next slide is Maine, the causes of World War I, all right? Militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. And you can see in the slides the important thing here and how they kind of came together. All right? First of all, you have imperialism. Right? Imperialism, as we've already talked about, the expanding of these powers globally, all right, for economic reasons, for prestige reasons, whatever. All right? Since they expanded globally, they then needed military power to protect those things, namely the growth of navies, coaling stations, all that sort of stuff. Then in doing all of that, a lot of countries, to secure peace and safety, as the little slide points out, they made alliances with one another. All right, and then lastly, the ideas of nationalism. I'm better than you. Our country's great. That kind of idea. And so we'll see this moving forward. The alliance system breaks down with, after the assassination of Ferdinand, the Austria-Hungarians want to basically punish Serbia and the Slavic peoples, and the Slavic peoples had a deal with Russia, and the dominoes sort of fell, and all the signs lined up against each other, and voila, we got World War I. Initially, the United States was okay with not being in the war. The word reached back to the United States after the Battle of the Somme, where 60,000 guys were killed in one day. America expressed some form of gratitude for not having to be involved in that. At the same time, there were people on both sides that were kind of leaning towards getting into the war, realized that most of the United States at this point was made up of second and third generation immigrants, and so they would have had ties back to Germany or Italy or England or whatever. Now, most of the government and intellectuals and the high guys in the military at this point were fans of England, so we tended to lean that way. Wilson, though, openly pushed for neutrality. Remember, that was still the idea going back to George Washington. Now, the war did serve us rather well in the sense that this type of warfare called for a lot of supplies, and troops needed to be fed, and so forth and so on. And so we ended up being the salesperson to both the sides of the war, and we made a lot of money during this time period. William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State, was openly against loaning money to either side because it kind of goes against the ideas of neutrality. Now, as I said, Wilson was pro Great Britain, so we tended to give the Allies more. We tended to loan them more money. We loaned them nearly $2 billion by the time we entered the war, while we only had loaned Germany $27 million at that point. Now, our neutrality rights, we saw that basically we shouldn't be attacked, but the problem is we had shipments going over to Europe, and Germany and Great Britain both had certain parts of the North Atlantic which they labeled as war zones. And at that point, at that time, the way that this worked was if you were going to sink a ship that had neutrals on it, you were supposed to stop them and let them off and then blow them up and all that sort of stuff. And England was flying its ships under neutral flags, which was kind of underhanded. So Germany basically starts to let it be known that they're going to start sinking ships that have anything to do with the war effort. And so this is around the time when the Lusitania is going to be sunk. And the problem was, as it says right there, it had U.S. citizens on it, even though the Germans had been saying for weeks, don't get on these ships. And the Germans said that the Lusitania had been armed. It wasn't, but it was carrying ammunition across, so I don't know if that makes it okay or what. But this gets the dander of the United States all up and at them, and Wilson begins to pressure the Germans. And eventually, Germany sinks another ship with Americans on it, and this time they make the Arabic Pledge. The Arabic Pledge is basically that liners will not be sunk by our submarines without warning and without safety of lives of non-combatants, provided that the liners do not try to escape or offer resistance. This seems to have been a victory for Wilson and his foreign policy. With the loss of all these American lives, though, now Wilson and the guys that are itching to get into the war can now begin to talk about preparedness, okay, and the idea that we'll eventually be pulled into this war. Now, today, I don't know how they would do this, but back in the day, you could debate it, I guess, openly. And they passed a series of acts during this time period. The National Defense Act, which would eventually expand the Army to 223,000 men. The Revenue Act of 1916 to help pay for it, which doubled income tax and basically raised tax rates on the wealthy and the guys that made stuff for war. And then also the Naval Construction Act, which set aside $500 million for the next 3 years to build ships. All of this was well and good, except that guys in the South and West of the United States were against all of this, and clearly they were also against Wilson. So when we get to the election of 1916, there's a chance there for the Republicans maybe to take back over. Now, even though on the slide here you can't see it because for some reason I got formatted and put the other bullet points behind the pictures, the next one is the election of 1916. So Teddy Roosevelt actually was trying to run again, but the thought of having Teddy Roosevelt run the country during a war of this magnitude was scary to most people. And also he had kind of made the cardinal sin of turning his back on his party, so the Republicans weren't going to nominate him. And they actually go for Charles Evans Hughes, who was very much like Wilson. He was a progressive governor. He had been a progressive governor. He was also a professor at one point, and currently he was a Supreme Court justice. Teddy Roosevelt actually said that he was a whiskered Woodrow Wilson because he had a kind of funky beard, as you can see here in the picture. Now, in the end, it doesn't really matter because Wilson campaigns better, and his peace and progressivism platform ends up pushing him through. And after he's reelected, he actually offers to mediate a truce between all the people, but nobody will listen to him. And he has this famous phrase, peace without victory and peace among equals, meaning that the only way for this to work is to actually step back to where we were. You can't, take this land or do anything like that for this to work out. Around the same time, Germany goes back on the Arabic Treaty and says they're going to have unrestricted naval warfare in the North Atlantic. And this causes Woodrow Wilson to withdraw the U.S. political ties to Germany. And right around the same time, the Zimmerman Note is going to be intercepted by the English and provided to us for our chagrin, that says Germany would be willing to aid Mexico in a war against us, and that they would give us part of the Southwest United States in return, basically hoping to tie up troops and so forth, and help the Germans on the war effort in Europe. And then lastly, what's going to happen is you're going to have the Russian Revolution, where the problems in Russia, famine, and no work and all this sort of stuff, boil over, and you have the 1917 revolution, which ousts the Tsar and puts on Kerensky in charge. Eventually, they get toppled by communism. But before that, this sort of made it look like to the American people that everyone in this fight was now fighting for some sort of democratic value, and that they were fighting against this imperialistic monarchy with the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire. And now that the Tsar had been ousted in Russia, that they looked like they wanted democracy. So it made sense for all these democracy-loving people to fight this war. And so we then enter into the war following the Zimmerman Note, the aggression of Germany in the North Atlantic, and then finally the now all-looking democratic fighting force. And as I said, this will be the end to part 1. I'll post part 2 later, and that will be the entirety of Chapter 25.